You two are advertised as offering some thoughts, which means either this is the definitive synthesis of everything that has gone before, or the start of a fight. Which is it?
Well, we're going to have fun with this. We hope we have 10 minutes, and it's kind of a unique exchange. Jessica and Dan have given us this opportunity, and so what we talked about doing is just having a kind of an interview, and I'm going to be the interviewer, and my august colleague to my left is really one of the great restoration experts in this system, largely because he's had his boots in the mud. He's got a marsh named after him, for crying out loud, and I think everyone would agree that particular project has evolved into a highly functioning small ecosystem.
Chris,
Patrick.
Since you're going to be the interviewer, would you reject the approach taken by many contemporary sports reporters and don't ask a question like, could you talk about?
Well, of course, if I am a pro athlete, I just say, well, we just take it one game at a time and do our best and stuff like that. So I will interject as if it strikes me too, but largely I'm going to try to ask some pointed questions. I thought I'd just lead off from where we just ended up, because I was sitting next to Carl and he was squirming quite a bit, and I could tell that he wanted to weigh in. The issue is trust. Really, there's a big tension as we move nascently into large-scale restoration at the scale of 8,000 acres for FERPA and 100,000 acres perhaps in the future. Between buying a property that has a boundary around it, that it's a political boundary, has nothing to do with ecology, and the real need and desire for a variety of reasons to make that property work as an ecological place, and helps to solve the co-eco goals. And so there is this tension, and so a lot of it is about science. We want to actually prove that ecosystem restoration projects work, but in order to do that, we've got to do it on the scale that we've got, which is a little tiny property here and there. Little tiny meaning 1,700, 3,000 acres, seemingly large, but to a delta smelt or a salmon, it's a truck stop on the way to a whole life history. So I think I want to ask Carl right off the bat, how do we develop trust with willing sellers, and how do we think about moving forward from project or from property to property, because that's all we can really ever acquire, and how do we develop trust both with landowners and stakeholders and make scientific sense as we want to actually prove properties work and then make landscape scale relevance in the future.
See if I can make this work. Okay, that's always the issue, is how you develop trust. I think the experience from Sassoon, when that planning process started, it was basically the participating agencies being called to the mat by the CalFed program leaders that said, we're all in this together and we're supposed to get better together. Why are you wrangling with each other and threatening to jeopardy opinions for one thing and another? And not allowing, management activities to move forward, which resulted in mistrust amongst the private landowners in the marsh, which had no interest in seeing any restoration moving forward, which was, not accomplishing anything for anybody. And so basically we were told to work together, and that takes a long time to overcome the mistrust. The big issue is, And this happens in all planning processes, and it needs to be a relatively personal interaction, and is generally precipitated by something that gets people's attention. It could be the fact that a bunch of scientists were in a room and came up with something, and it generated a map that got leaked or was distributed, and everybody got up in arms. Before that, they could have cared less. But once that was there, that created an opportunity to then have a dialogue. And I'm just going to recount the experiences I went through in eastern Contra Costa and Alameda County back in the biodiversity days with a group of interested planners and scientists that put together a biodiversity plan using existing information about where biological resources were and how you might approach conservation. That then created a firestorm out there, both politically with the developers, with the landowners, with the Citizens Land Alliance, with the RCDs, the Farm Bureau. And the next step was that we all spent, 3+ years, once a month in Livermore, talking about what the plan was, how you might approach it, educating each other to issues. And that ultimately spawned a desire, particularly in Contra Costa County, people realized that, there might be something in it for me relative to the resources. And in Contra Costa County, with the development community, they saw, maybe we can get a streamlined permitting process and not fight tooth and nail every project. And that led to what I view as the most successful, certainly in Northern California, NCCP-HCP going. It's been in place for about 5 years now. It involves 4 cities, the county, and the transportation agencies. It's achieved a lot of conservation. Because of the downturn, there hasn't been much development. And in the meantime, using willing sellers and having money available, they have accomplished a great deal. But that, if you start at the beginning, took 10 years to build the relationships to make that kind of thing happen. So, when you talk about building trust, it's a long-term proposition. It's like, how do you start something like this in the South Delta about restoration and even having a conversation about restoration? How would you go about it? I think the approach that's been taken to date is it's a restoration opportunity area. There's no definition in it, and it's going to be way down the line if you're thinking about BDCP. But you have to have some way of having the conversation and bringing people together to talk about it so the interests can be put on the table. And in the absence of that, it's really difficult. And it may be able to be used through the RCDs or the reclamation districts, or maybe something that could be fostered through the DPC to talk about how you would develop that kind of thing and how people's interests could be accommodated in the context of meeting restoration targets or needs and maintaining existing uses and optimizing those so that, there are benefits derived by both, either through flood control benefits, by combining habitat and flood projects, which I think is, probably the way a lot of this is going to get done. So, that's kind of a long-winded answer, but, it's a difficult thing. But it's a key thing to make something happen. And you have to, as Dennis described, conduct substantial outreach and engage people, although it's difficult until they feel like in many cases, that there's a threat for them to understand that they need to engage or that they need to engage.
So, if there's a question.
I was just going to note it's end of a long day. It's 10 to 4, and Carl mumbles on with trying to answer Chris's question. And at first I thought I didn't have to listen to this because he's saying, well, there's not much you can do except be nice to people. And then I realized you actually said a lot. And buried in that was a lot. And part of it is that you can get people's attention by terrorizing them, by getting a plan together by a bunch of scientists in a secret room as proposed by a prior panelist. And then, then you can start talking to them. But the other part was really that you can utilize some trustworthy intermediaries like the Delta Protection Commission, which has a history of working on some of these and being helpful. So I think Don knows more about that, but I thought that was a good suggestion. And then you pointed out that the potential projects have more than one beneficiary and or more than one benefit, and as a consequence, the ability to, in a project, do something that property owners in the community want, like flood protection, can be part of what makes a habitat project that on its own meets with resistance possible. So I think there's some opportunities that you're suggesting, and since you went to the black hole ground zero, which is the South Delta, to talk about it, that's pretty brave, Carl.
I have a high level of tolerance for those kinds of things.
So to get to the how and by whom, which is a key question that Councilman Fiorini asked earlier, Carl, in your pocket is a telephone, and that phone's going to ring over the next few years, and on the line are going to be a landowner or someone who represents a reclamation district, and they're going to say, Carl, we want to sell our reclamation district, or we're really interested in granting you a conservation easement. So can you tell us what are the steps? What are the things that you'll say to that person, and who will then have the responsibility for deciding, do we buy it? Do we hold it? Do we restore it now? How do we connect it up with all the other possibilities around it? And climate change is happening, and everybody's pissed off. So what's your guidance on that sort of stepwise process?
Okay, this goes to the question of goals. If in the agenda it talks about the importance of regional goals and the San Francisco Bay Lands Ecosystem Goals. That's something I co-chaired. It took us, it was something that we were going to do through the Estuary Project. Again, it was a bunch of scientists looking at biological needs. We weren't looking at sociological needs. We weren't looking at economic needs. We were just looking at biological needs, and if you could do what you could do, this was what would be good. And we fought amongst ourselves, waterfowl and shorebirds against clapper rails and tidal marsh and fish and native plants. So, and ultimately generated a report. We'd expected it was going to be 50 pages long maybe and take us 6 months. It took us 3 years. Had independent science input along the way, and ended up being a 300-page document with a second ecological communities document using the information that was generated from it separately. But it did provide the basis. It became very controversial, particularly in Sassoon Marsh, because it did have a map in it. It wasn't the map but it was a representation of what the recommendations in the report could potentially look like. It was a non-agency document. It was prepared by a number of organizations, but nobody had any particular ownership other than the estuary project. But it served as the basis for guiding where and how restoration should be done. It's not so different in Sassoon from what's in the current Sassoon Marsh Restoration and Management Plan, as far as where you should do tidal marsh restoration and that kind of thing. But it did serve as the basis for, the allocations to San Francisco Bay in Prop 50. It set the stage for the South Bay Salt Ponds acquisitions, which included acquisitions both in the North and the South Bay. And it's provided the guide for where and how to pursue acquisitions and restorations. So having something like that, maybe sans the map, would be a helpful thing. Right now, people call me up and say, does this make sense? I become the arbiter. I don't want to be the arbiter. Then I have to kind of represent what my federal fish colleagues might think. So it would be much better if everybody was kind of on the same page on where to do things. I don't think that's that difficult. The Delta Plan has restoration opportunity areas. BDCP has restoration opportunities. The Stage 2 conservation strategy for ERP has conservation priority areas, and they're all the same. It's all pretty clear where it's most likely to do this work. So you have a starting point. The next part is, what are your goals? I think for the most part, the wetland restoration component, the tidal component, is focused on generating food web support for fish and or potentially habitat for fish. That's its role. That's the goal of those kinds of activities. But I think standardization of the objectives or goals of the restoration activities would be helpful so that people aren't constantly reinventing. And then having a more standardized monitoring program for evaluation. Sure, you've got to account for whether or not it performed, but these aren't mitigation projects. These are restoration projects. You describe the goals. You want to know if you're getting what you thought you were going to get from a habitat perspective. But the more important part is, are they generating the benefits that you're expecting them to provide resource benefits away from them, and to support the ecosystem as a whole, not just for their particular intrinsic values. So I don't know if folks who listened to NPR saw some of the clippings about smoothhound sharks in South San Francisco Bay, and how all of a sudden they're all over the place now that there's been extensive tidal restoration in the South Bay. But, those kinds of relationships go on. And so it's having the types of monitoring programs that are standardized, so we're looking at the ecosystem and not just every little project. One of the things that drives me crazy is that every project has its own monitoring program. And that's crazy, especially when we're talking about doing things at the scale we're talking about, even if it's just the 8,000 acres that are in the BO, or the 5 to 7 in the Sassoon plan.
Questions from the council? I got more.
It was recommended that somebody should prepare overarching principles for restoration. Is that de facto the Delta Science Plan, and are we headed in the right direction?
Well, I think it may be a little bit more relative to what the goals or objectives are for particular types of habitat restoration. And I don't think those are specified per se in the Delta Plan. But you, for good, bad, or indifferent, BDCP has 214 objectives that get at those kinds of, in much greater detail at those kinds of goals and objectives from a biological perspective.
Sorry.
Go ahead. But, this has always been the struggle of what are performance measures or what are the goals and objectives. CalFed had nice, broad, general goals and never got down to the specifics. We've gotten a lot farther with what's in BDCP. And I think, the basis for a lot of those things is there now. And, how you incorporate those into the Delta Science Plan, would be one way to approach it. But it would be helpful if people were running off of the same goals and objectives.
Chris, is the science mature enough for us to describe a final end result that we desire for restoration in the Delta?
Yes. Shall I? It's so this is a $64,000 question. So if you're asking me, and I think if you ask most scientists, even in the bowels of the regulatory agencies, there are scientists who are squirming around there saying, our charge at Fish and Wildlife Service is to recover this species and that species, but really we want to think about recovery of the resilience of native species so that we can keep not only the ones that are on the endangered species list off, but keep the future ones that are coming down the line off the endangered species list. We don't remind ourselves enough that what we're here to do is to solve the co-equal goals. And that means making native species resilient to all the changes that are coming at us. And so when we say, is the science mature enough, do we know? I think if John Weems was sitting here, if I could channel him, he would call it success if we can connect up landscapes and aquatic corridors in ways that are really complex. The issue is to restore a bunch of options on the landscape for native species because they know how to use it. They'll use it in different ways. They'll never be as abundant as they once were. There'll always be striped bass and black bass and other non-natives, and they're going to be coming. The issue is to create a complex mosaic on the landscape and call it good. Most of us think that's where we're headed. The idea that we could. Do we think the science is? If you're asking me this, really, what some of the regulations and BDCP are going to ultimately ask us to do is that fish over there fat because of that levee breach we put in over there? We'll never be able to answer that question. Unfortunately, that's something about what the performance measures are headed toward. I lament that. I think we are mature enough, the science is mature enough, if we stop at basic physical and chemical and biological processes, and then step back and be amazed at what the ecosystem does and how it is resilient to all comers, including climate change, population growth, toxics, all kinds of stuff. That to me is our task. So are we mature enough to ask to judge ourselves in the right way? That is the open question, and there's a big tension there between how we're going to be asked to judge our performance and the way I think biologists and ecologists are thinking about how we might judge ourselves. How's that?
Well, I think that's a good answer, and I like it. And I guess being mature enough to judge ourselves in a way that perhaps doesn't give an answer that's as satisfactory from an accountant's perspective is part of the challenge.
Well, I don't think we'll ever, do well as from an accounting perspective per se, because these things are going to change and they're going to continue to change and develop, particularly into the future, given the changes that we're going to experience. So we can't, if you talked to me 15 years ago, I would have told you, this is going to look like that. Well, subsequently, all stages of a restoration, provide benefit. The idea that you have to have a Spartina marsh or a fully vegetated marsh because that's what you set out to do, it doesn't mean that because of one thing or another, because you had constrained tidal access for a while, you just had mudflat and that the marsh didn't come. There's an awful lot that's been going on that mudflat in the intervening period that's benefited a lot of other species. And you'll get there to that fully vegetated marsh at some point in the future. But it's a continuum.
And the point I wanted to get at a little bit with that question was it's not so much returning the abundance of salmon into the Delta or the San Francisco Bay or the Pacific Ocean. It's more maintaining the diversity of those species within the Delta, but recognizing that the quantity and maybe the quality of the diversity will shift, but that we can maintain that diversity if we set our minds to that.
Right, and I think part of it is putting, as the PPIC reports have indicated, and Peter Moyle has talked about, putting heterogeneity back into the system. The Delta is not a very heterogeneous environment. It's channels and kind of hardened levees.
One thing we've learned lately in the last 10 years in the ecology literature is that stability of populations is derived from diversity of options that species have to play out on landscapes. Right now, we force salmon to do one strategy, and that is get through the Delta as fast as possible. Because if you try another strategy as a salmon, you'll probably die. You need to get through the gauntlet, and you need to get to the ocean as fast as possible because that's where the food is. What we need to do is in that gauntlet is to provide options for salmon to diversify what we'll call their phenotypic traits. And that some individuals will rear on floodplains. Some individuals will go into tidal marshes, and they'll feed there, and they'll spend time there. Others will head for the ocean fast. And the idea is to expand the portfolio of opportunities. They call it the portfolio effect in actuality, in the ecology literature, to expand the portfolio of options that species have. That's where resilience for species comes from. Thinking about numbers isn't going to be helpful. We'll always have big years, but we'll also have years that crash if we don't provide for options on the landscape. So that's why a lot of us think, provision of habitat spaces and types and complexity is really the best we can do, and we should call that good. We should call it success.
Okay, we've got a request from the public to speak, so we're going to have to move on shortly. Anything you want to say in wrapping up?
Thanks for the opportunity. I think, one of the great things we're trying to figure out is how do scientists talk to policy people. And I've had some opportunities over the last several days to do that, and, I think it's a rich dialogue, and we'll talk past each other for most of the time, but, that's okay.
And just on the accountability issue, if nothing more, the fact that the council's here asking these kinds of questions and making us pay attention and coordinate is a good thing. So I don't know that there's necessarily active intervention that's needed right now, because we have nascent processes like the Restoration Network that I think will bear fruit in coordinating these kinds of things. And I think most restoration practitioners are thinking about connectivity and how things fit together. and the continuums of habitat restoration. So,
Thank you. Okay.